thanks very much for the opportunity to present this morning. I see we have a really great turnout, so thanks everyone for setting the time aside this morning to join this webinar. So the topic of my presentation is really around this concept of waste as having value, and particularly looking at the insights from Africa. And there are quite a few concepts that I'm going to very briefly touch on this morning. And we could probably have a webinar like this just for each one of them. So feel free to drop your chats in, and certainly we can have more detailed discussions around some of the particular issues after the presentation. I think the reality is, and many of us have seen images like these of the plastic challenge that is facing Africa. It's not unusual to see photos like this. These photos, for example, from Nigeria, came up last year, I think it was, although 2020 is a bit of a blur. I think it was early last year after the heavy rains in Lagos. We saw photos like this on social media around plastic, in this case, a lot of polystyrene backing up. And we're seeing plastic leak into our environment in Africa, whether it be leaking to land, leaking to fresh water, leaking into our marine environment, impacting air quality, etc., really at an unprecedented rate. Again, images like these as well, the results of changing consumption patterns in Africa, a growing middle class combined with very weak collection systems. The Africa Waste Management Outlook unpacks this in more detail. This combination of increasing and changing waste streams combined with weak collection really does exacerbate this issue in terms of waste and plastic waste leaking into the environment. We also see the impact that this has in terms of flooding. Again, this waste, when it leaks into stormwater canals, into rivers where it backs up, we've seen the impact of this, of flooding in cities. We had incidents of resultant deaths from flooding as well. So, we're seeing the direct environmental impact of this. We're seeing the potential resultant disease. We're seeing the environmental pollution, the flooding that results from this plastic in the environment. Just in the last year and a bit as well, we've had numerous cases of dump sites and landfills catching alight. We've seen these landfill fires, the significant impact they burn for weeks on end in some cases. You can see the plastic, for example, in this dump site. And obviously the impact that this has in terms of air quality as well. And this is something that thankfully is receiving a lot more attention now at the global level in terms of whether it be intentional or accidental burning, open burning of waste. We're also seeing, numerous products now being put onto the market in Africa where producers or retailers know full well that there is no end-of-life solution for dealing with these products at end of life, including whether it be safe disposal to landfill sites. And in this photo, you can see these are diapers that are just being dumped in the field after use because there's no collection system in place, there's no disposal system. And obviously we know that there's large amounts of plastic as well in these diapers and in other sanitary products as well. And the result of this, unprecedented leakage of plastic into the environment in Africa is that we're seeing governments now, it's, forcing the hand of governments to take action. And very often it's this knee-jerk reaction to take drastic action to deal with this leakage. And very often this knee-jerk reaction is banning certain plastic products. The UN report of 2018 identified 29 countries, and that figure has most certainly been updated and has increased in the last 2 years now. But we're seeing numerous countries, particularly coastal countries, as you can see in the diagram, now putting regulations in place against plastics. And very often these are product ban regulations. Most of these have started looking at carrier bags, single-use plastic carrier bags, for example. But we're also seeing the discussion now spill over into other single-use plastic products as well, whether it be in terms of disposable cutlery, crockery, takeaway containers, etc. So we're seeing this increase in bans of single-use plastics on the African continent. And I suppose it links to this particular question that arose in the Breaking the Plastic Wave study. And we're seeing this debate globally in terms of what should the response be to dealing with plastic leakage into the environment. And we've got these different schools of thought. We have this one group, as we're seeing in Africa, for example, that says, well, let's just ban it. If we ban single-use plastics, we solve the problem. And very often we're seeing this coming from NGOs, from lobby groups that are very anti-plastic, very anti-single-use plastics. And then on the other side, we have this different school of thought that says, well, in fact, this is just a waste management problem. If we put proper collection systems in place, if we put safe disposal systems in place, we could solve the plastic problem. Plastic is not the problem, it's a waste management problem. And very often we're seeing this argument come from the plastics industry itself, who's obviously wanting to continue to put plastic into the market and the sale of plastics. We have another group that says, well, let's just transition everything to biodegradable. So if it leaks into the environment, it's fine. It'll just biodegrade in situ. There's another group that says, well, we can recycle our way out of this problem. We just need to collect it and we can recycle it. And thankfully, there's a very small group that says, well, let it leak into the environment and we'll just do, numerous cleanup campaigns and we'll just clean it up out of the environment. So we have all of these different opposing schools of thought. And the problem is that nobody up until, well, at least last year, had really looked at these different propositions and said, well, how do these strategies perform? How do they perform from an environmental perspective, an economic perspective, a social perspective? Are they appropriate for different materials, for different polymers, for different products? Are they appropriate for different countries, for different geographies, for example? Do we understand how they might actually interact with each other? What would it cost? For example, what would be the investments that would be required to implement one or all of these different propositions? And really importantly, how quickly could they be implemented? And so, it was essentially this argument and this confusion, I suppose one could say, in terms of, what is the actual solution to dealing with plastic waste that led to the study that was done by Systemic and Pew, which I'll touch on briefly, which is the Breaking the Plastic Wave study. And the problem, though, is that, while we continue to have this debate, should we ban, should we substitute, should we recycle, should we collect and dispose, waste is continuing to leak into our environment. And so we don't have the luxury of time anymore to debate these issues. We have to start implementing action, and we need to do that now. So I want to in this presentation, I want to touch just very briefly on what I see as kind of 3 key documents, which are informing at least, my thinking in terms of how we deal with this issue, and hopefully others as well in the waste sector. First of all, at the global level, this Breaking the Plastic Wave study, and I think some of you may have been exposed to this report before, and certainly the findings of the report. And I'm going to give you the answers ahead of the time. The Breaking the Plastic Waves report really says we need to take a systems approach. It's not any one of those 5. In fact, it's all 5 of those. We need upstream, we need the reduction, the substitution, we need the downstream, we need the collection, disposal, recycling. So it's a systems approach that we need. The second one is the Africa Waste Management Outlook, the second report. And obviously, because it's a waste management report, it focuses specifically on the downstream interventions. And there the report calls for us to bring waste under control, and then secondly, to harness the opportunities of waste. And then the third report, which I very briefly want to touch on, is a South Africa specific report, which is South Africa's 10-year waste research, development and innovation roadmap. And again, because it's a waste roadmap, it's focusing on downstream solutions. And really it speaks to the second point of the Africa Waste Management Outlook, which is around harnessing the opportunities of waste. So how can we find value in waste as resource through innovation? So very briefly, I'm just going to touch on these. So the first, in terms of the Breaking the Plastic Wave report, and I've provided the links in these if you'd like to follow up on them afterwards. But really the Breaking the Plastic Wave report says to us that if we are going to solve this problem around plastic leaking into the environment, we need a plastics economy that is smart, that is sustainable, and that is circular. So what do we mean by that? The first thing that essentially this study looked at was to say, well, are we doing enough? And the model that was produced as part of the Breaking the Plastic Wave study essentially modeled globally what are our current commitments. So that map, for example, that I showed you around the bans of single-use plastic products in Africa, it looked at what the EU is doing, the US, the Asia Pacific region, for example. What are the current commitments? And sadly, what the model showed us is that if we implement all of the current or imminent commitments around single-use plastics, we are only likely to reduce the leakage of plastic into the global marine environment by 7%. So it really is a tiny dent in terms of dealing with this issue around plastic waste leaking into our environment. So it's quite clear that it's nowhere near enough in terms of scale of action that's needed to address the waste issue, and certainly the plastic waste issue. And as I said, what the report came back to us with is that we need this systems approach, as shown in this diagram. We need a reduction strategy. And the model showed us that in terms of maximizing, or in this case, minimizing leakage, plastic waste leakage to the marine environment, so maximizing our actions, we would need to reduce plastic into the system by 30%. We would need to substitute plastic in the system by 17%. We would need to recycle as a solution in terms of 20% and disposal 23%. But it still leaves us, despite all of our best intentions, it still leaves us with 10% of plastic leaking into the environment. But ultimately, what it shows us is that by taking the systems approach, we can reduce plastic leaking into the environment by around 82% through these upstream and downstream interventions. Interestingly, what the report also showed us is that by doing this, we would actually reach peak plastic production, virgin plastic production globally by 2027. So that obviously opens up a whole new debate in terms of investment in new virgin plastic manufacturing and production, in terms of potential investment in obsolete assets. So as I said, that's a whole separate discussion one can get into. But following on from this Breaking the Plastic Wave study and what it tells us in terms of this systems approach to dealing with waste is what some of the recommendations that came out of the Africa Waste Management Outlook, an initiative of the United Nations Environment Programme, which was published back in 2018. And as I said, it spoke to these two particular levers that we need. The one is around bringing waste under control. And I'll touch on these each in a little bit more detail. And then secondly, around this issue of harnessing the opportunity of waste as resource. And that's essentially what I want to touch on in terms of this presentation, in terms of the value of waste. So in terms of bringing waste under control, the basic issues that we need to put in place, the city cleansing, the waste collection, the safe disposal, these are the fundamentals. This is the foundation of integrated waste management, which we are not seeing in Africa. And these issues, these three simple basic issues, have to become a priority for African countries, for cities and towns across the continent. The Breaking the Plastic Wave report essentially told us that we have to scale up collection rates, particularly in low and middle income countries where we see most of the leakage of waste into the environment occurring. So we need to scale up to at least 90% collection rates in urban areas and at least 50% in rural areas to stop this leakage into the environment. But essentially what this means is that we have to bring globally 4 billion people into waste collection systems. That's 500,000 people a day, every day of the week between now and 2040, which is a staggering thought. And, we've already lost 6 months since the Breaking the Plastic Wave study was published. So, these similar kind of numbers need to be modeled for the likes of Africa, for different countries in Africa. How many people do we need to bring into waste collection to stop this leakage of waste into the environment? We're seeing images like this, and particularly in this one, you can see the amount of, for example, lightweight plastic that's being openly dumped to land, which just blows around the environment, continues to leak into the environment. But when I look at photos like this as well, what we're seeing is I essentially see viable resources. I see viable polymer there. I see viable nutrients in terms of the organic waste, viable metal in terms of the cans that are being disposed, fiber, for example, in terms of the paper that we see disposed to these dump sites. And so this is what links to the second point around the Africa Waste Management Outlook recommendations, which was this issue of we need to harness the opportunities of waste as resource. So once we've done those other things, once we've looked at the upstream, once we've reduced the amount of waste that could possibly be generated, once we've brought waste under control in terms of safe collection and disposal, what do we do with that residual waste that is still being produced? And so thankfully, we're starting to see recycling emerge across the African continent very slowly, I might add. Sadly, it's tended to be driven more by issues around poverty, around unemployment. It's been driven by socio-economic needs because there is this value in waste. So people can collect it and they can sell it and they can earn some kind of a basic livelihood or basic income. So it's in very limited cases is it actually being driven sort of by public and private sector design. The Africa Waste Management Outlook estimated as well that around about 70 to 80% of municipal solid waste that is generated in Africa is in fact recyclable. Yet, as at that date, only 4% of municipal solid waste was actually recycled. And I think, one of the things that we're probably all familiar with is, if you drive around a city or town in Africa on Waste Collection Day, for example, you'll see a very, very active informal sector that is actually collecting recyclables. And they're this very important bridge between the service chain and between the value chain in terms of bringing these viable resources into the recycling economy. In Africa, it's estimated that more than 70% of the recyclables that are collected by this informal sector. Globally, the Breaking the Plastic Wave study showed us, globally across low, middle, and high income countries, it's around about 58% of post-consumer plastic waste that's collected by the informal sector. The other thing that, we're seeing more and more evidence, we're seeing more and more research showing us that diverting waste away from dump sites, diverting waste up the waste management hierarchy towards reuse, towards recycling, towards waste recovery does create local opportunities, and it creates local socio-economic opportunities. So there is this inherent economic value that sits in waste, that sits in end-of-life products. And at the same time, if we can divert waste away from these dump sites, as we've seen in some of the previous images, we have this opportunity to also address some of the key environmental issues. So we found that this has actually been quite a good, it's a point that's received a lot of sort of political attention, and it's kind of mobilized political attention. Is if I always say, if the environment was important enough to countries, we wouldn't have waste and we wouldn't have pollution problems. But sadly, it's not. But by driving this very strong socio-economic opportunity agenda, that has found a lot of political attraction, and particularly the opportunity of unlocking potential jobs in diverting waste away from dump sites. So we have this opportunity to essentially address two issues at the same time. We have the opportunity to address these key environmental issues, as we've seen in previous slides, while at the same time unlocking the value and unlocking the opportunities. The Africa Waste Management Outlook showed us that we could inject $8 billion of resource value into the African economy every year by diverting waste away from these dump sites into reuse, recycling, and recovery. But sadly, this 96% or near $7.6 billion is currently lost to the economy. This resource value is lost to the economy because it ends up being illegally dumped. It ends up in these stormwater canals. It ends up, being dumped into uncontrolled or controlled dump sites, or it ends up being burnt. A similar study like this was done, in fact, for South Africa back in 2012. Colleagues of mine at the CSR looked at this issue in terms of what is the value of waste as resource. And that study showed us that in South Africa, we were generating at least, near on $1.7 billion worth of resource value as waste in South Africa, of which we were losing back then around $1.1 billion. Apologies, I need to correct the B's missing there. $1.13 billion of resources which were lost to the economy through disposal of waste to landfill. What was also very interesting, and this touches on this issue in terms of, what is the most appropriate solution for end-of-life management of waste. We see in the EU, for example, we see a very strong approach in terms of waste to energy, thermal treatment of waste, burning the waste. And one of the big debates is this appropriate for Africa? What are the most appropriate technology solutions for dealing with waste at end of life? And what the study showed us for South Africa is that certainly in terms of economic benefit and economic value for the country, there's approximately a 10-fold greater economic benefit of putting plastic waste, for example, through material recovery through recycling, as opposed to through waste to energy solutions. The other thing that the report showed us is essentially the unit value. So in other words, what someone would be prepared to pay for that particular waste stream is in fact greater than the cost of landfilling. So again, it posed this question, well then why do we see this loss of resource value, of economic potential through disposal of waste to land? The second point in terms of this value in waste, the previous slides touched on the economic value. The second point is around the social value that is provided through the collection and safe management of waste. This is particularly relevant, I would argue, in countries where we see high unemployment rates, and certainly this speaks to many countries in Africa. Certainly now in terms of kind of a post-COVID economic response, we've seen the impact of the pandemic on employment rates globally. But in Africa, certainly when we were having this discussion back in 2018 for the Africa Waste Management Outlook, the employment challenge was twofold at that stage. It was really around saying, given the levels of education on the continent, the levels of schooling on the continent, how do we create large numbers of low-skilled jobs for those that are currently unemployed? And then secondly, how do we actually grow the economy to create new job opportunities and to unlock these new social opportunities within the economy? So that means, how do we unlock new economic sectors? And absolutely, the waste and secondary resources economy does provide us with the potential to unlock these new economic sectors, whether it be unlocking growth in recycling, whether it be putting recycled content back into our manufacturing economy through kind of local collection and reintroduction systems, whether it be even through circular economy initiatives, sharing economy initiatives, thinking even more broadly in terms of the discussions that are emerging now more recently since the publication of the Africa Waste Management Outlook. But obviously this does require upskilling and reskilling and developing new skills in the economy as well. And again, this links to the whole issue around education, around awareness, and around upskilling for a circular economy and a green economy. And one of the things that we found is that, yes, the waste sector does provide us with an opportunity to do both of these. The waste sector provides us with an opportunity to create low-skilled jobs, and it does create us with an opportunity to create new economic sectors, which creates new potential job opportunities and hence new social value. The immediate opportunities that we saw, again, looking at those previous slides around waste leaking into the environment, absolutely in terms of open spaces cleaning. As I said, this is the foundation of any integrated waste management system. It's around city cleansing. How do we keep our streets and our cities, our open spaces clean? How do we address these issues of illegal dumping? And it's great to see, on social media, I'm seeing so many more municipalities and city councils putting resources into this issue around keeping cities and town clean. But again, it's this fine balance of, we've got to be very careful that we don't continue to perpetuate this issue of job creation through littering. And again, we always hear this sort of urban legend of people saying, well, I litter because it creates jobs. And my response to that is, well, yes, it does, but it doesn't create as many jobs as if you put that waste into the bin, and that waste could then flow into a recycling economy. So short-term interventions, absolutely, in terms of open spaces cleaning, waste collection, absolutely. We know that those previous slides about bringing 500,000 households per day into the waste collection system. Waste collection obviously is a very labor intensive activity as well, and also the potential for job creation. And then this issue of sorting, on the African continent, that point around only 4% of waste is currently recycled. Can we put people into manual sorting and recovery of recyclables to feed into a recycling economy? And as I said, all of these points, these three immediate opportunities for job creation and enterprise development, are very labor intensive activities, and they also have very low barriers to entry if people are wanting to start up their own small businesses or to start up their own cooperatives to enter into this space. And so it's in this implementation, as I think I alluded to before, it's in this implementation of the waste hierarchy. It's in this moving waste up the hierarchy towards waste reduction, reuse, recycling that we unlock this economic value and we unlock this social value. And it's this unlocking the potential to create jobs. This table on the right-hand side now is unfortunately a little out of date. And in fact, we've asked our research chair in Waste and Society to see whether they're able to update these figures, certainly for South Africa. But you can see, for example, that we have the potential to create more jobs as we move up the hierarchy. So for every one job in landfilling, we could create 4 jobs in composting. We could create 25 jobs in recycling. We could create even more in terms of reuse, depending on the particular product that's being reused. So again, there's this very, very important social imperative to move waste up the hierarchy as well, away from these images that we see of dumping of waste to land and then the resultant leakage of this waste into the environment. So the question that I'm always asked after, making a presentation like this is, well, if we have this economic value and if we have this social value in the waste that is being generated in Africa, or certain across the world. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be in Africa. I mean, the similar thinking applies no matter where you are in the world. Why is it that we are seeing still 96% of municipal solid waste in Africa being disposed of to land, and typically, as the image on the left shows, to these kind of uncontrolled dump sites? Why are we not unlocking this value that sits within waste as resource? And so for me, at least, my understanding of this is that waste is ultimately an economic issue. It's around how do we get the economics of waste management right? It doesn't cost anybody anything to dump waste to land like we're seeing on the left. There's no capex cost involved in this kind of dump site. There's minimal, if any, kind of operational costs, any OPEX involved in this. And the result of these poor waste management practices that we're seeing now is that it skews the entire economic system around waste management. It makes disposal of waste to land incredibly cheap, which makes everything else in the hierarchy relatively more expensive. So you can't even compost cheaper than what you can dispose of this waste to land, like we're seeing on the left-hand side. So how do we correct this economics around waste? And then secondly, how do we also get the financing of this right? We know that the waste sector is considered, certainly in developing countries, it's considered a high-risk investment area. It's why we're seeing very little investment coming from the likes, of the World Bank or Development Bank of Southern Africa, for example, particularly in the waste sector. It's very attractive to invest into energy systems, into water systems, but we see less and less, financial investment into the waste management sector. So how do we address this issue as well in terms of financing? Obviously, there are a number of policy, and again, this is a slide that we could spend a lot of time on, but there are a lot of policy opportunities for us to correct the economics around waste and to unlock this value that we're seeing in the system. Some of them are mentioned below. So, we have opportunities to make one technology relatively more expensive than the other. We see this, for example, through strict enforcement around landfill design, landfill operation, landfill closure, which then increases the OPEX and CAPEX around these types of activities. In the EU, for example, we've seen kind of the artificial increase in cost through the application of taxes. First of all, it was through the application of landfill taxes, more recently through incineration taxes as well, which is meant to drive waste into the circular economy and up the waste hierarchy. We're seeing it, for example, in the implementation of extended producer responsibility, which is around shifting the financial and operational responsibility of managing waste at end of life away from government to the producer. So again, correcting the economics, we see it, for example, through setting recycling targets. It's kind of this line in the sand that the private sector has to achieve, almost kind of irrespective of cost, which means the private sector has to essentially subsidize a recycling economy or a circular economy. We can also sort of, what I've put, force the development of new markets. So how do we create the demand for this material, which would also help to address the economics? Things like green procurement, for example, regulations around recycled content, for example, in products. And again, I've been focusing a lot on the downstream, on the waste side, because that's the space that I work in. But similarly, we can apply these same kind of policy instruments, these same kind of economic instruments upstream, in terms of how do we incentivize better product design. So within extended producer responsibility, we see this issue around eco-modulated fees, that the more difficult your product is to recycle, the higher the fee is that you pay, and again, around correcting these economics. So I'm not going to go into a lot more detail around the policy, but, absolutely we need to be aware of the fact that we need these appropriate policy instruments to correct the skewed economics within the system. So finally, just in wrapping up, because I think I've been going quite some time, the Breaking the Plastic Wave made this comment that it's not the lack of technical solutions that is preventing us from addressing plastic pollution. It's rather inadequate regulatory frameworks, it's inadequate business models, and inadequate funding mechanisms. And absolutely, I'd say, certainly the report showed us that we could achieve that 82% reduction by technology that's available if we just put the right regulation in place, businesses and funding mechanisms. But the report also showed us that there's this last 10% that we need to deal with, this last 10% that's still leaking into the environment despite our best efforts. And this is where innovation is required. And so the last one that I want to just touch on is the work that we're doing in South Africa through the implementation of government's 10-year waste research, development and innovation roadmap. And I've just popped a couple of projects that we're currently funding into this. And you can see just from these 4 examples on this slide, it's really around how we use research and development, how we use innovation to create these new end-use markets, to create this value in waste that would essentially drive these products at end of life away from disposal of land into recycling or into recovery or further beneficiation, because we've created this value and hence we've created demand. So the grant project around waste plastic in road construction, to help create demand for taking plastic out of the waste stream. Understanding, how we deal with bio-based plastic material. Should we be investing in it? Should we be putting it into the market? What products does it make sense to transition to bio-based or biodegradable projects? Opportunities for product recovery through thermal treatment as well. And then some really innovative ones. There's the work around the metal organic frameworks that was also done. But also, it's not just about the technology development, it's also around evidencing the decisions. So things like, for example, life cycle sustainability assessments, things like cost benefit analysis, techno-economic feasibility studies, these tools that we need to use to inform our decisions on the most appropriate environmental, economic and social response to dealing with waste at end of life. The guidelines we funded around the integration of the informal sector into the waste economy, given the fact that they play this crucial role in taking resources out of the waste stream and putting them into the recycling economy. So my last slide, just in conclusion, coming back to that very first point from the Breaking the Plastic Wave around, the fact that we need the smart, sustainable and circular plastics economy, and certainly even, beyond plastics, a waste economy across the other streams as well, into organic waste, into the other recyclables, is that, yes, hopefully after this presentation, you recognize as well that we do need both these upstream and downstream interventions, and we need them now. We do not have the luxury of time anymore to debate these issues. We need action now, both upstream and downstream. We need to recognize waste as a resource, because by recognizing waste as a resource and recognizing the value that is inherent in that waste stream, it really is the first step towards responsible waste management. It's the first step in terms of better product design upstream, in making sure that we retain that inherent resource value through the value chain and through the life cycle of that product. Absolutely, it's about correcting the economics around waste, which I've touched on. It's around putting appropriate policy in place. It's not necessarily around kind of plugging and playing and dropping policy from other countries, but understanding, are these policy responses appropriate for the country? And finally, it's around innovation. How do we unlock these new innovation opportunities? So as I said, I could go into a lot more detail into each of those slides, and you know, it'd be great to have further discussions around these, but I'm going to stop at that point and see if there are any particular questions and discussion points. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Linda. I see there's a comment and a question from Carl that says, outstanding presentation as always. Could you comment a little on energy recovery, such as incineration and pyrolysis, which are very popular options in Norway?
Yeah, well, thanks very much, Carl, for your comment and also your question. That question, again, I could spend a whole day just discussing that one, and I've got my own personal sort of particular views on it as well. I think that you know, we're seeing a lot of European countries, for example, coming to Africa wanting to sell waste to energy technologies, particularly thermal treatment technologies like incineration and pyrolysis. And part of this is given the fact that new EU regulations are almost soft capping the amount of waste that can go into thermal treatment through the new circular economy directives, the plastic directives, etc., which now set quite steep recycling targets. So obviously companies are looking for new markets, and they're coming to Africa as well to potentially sell these technologies. There are a couple of issues around that, is that first of all, the waste that we see in Africa has a very high organic waste content. There's a lot of food waste, there's a lot of garden waste, there's a lot of wet waste in the municipal waste stream. And this makes it incredibly difficult to burn through a municipal waste incineration process, for example. We've seen this, for example, in India, where they essentially had to co-fire the municipal waste together with coal. So they were burning coal to dry out the waste to then be able to burn the waste, which, you know, just absolutely doesn't make sense. We've seen the Repi plant in Ethiopia. I think it was also shut down for a couple of weeks because of this issue around wet waste, and it's just very difficult to burn. So at one of the International Solid Waste Association conferences, there was actually this kind of north-south debate in terms of, do developing countries have to follow the same technology trajectory as we've seen, for example, in Europe? Do we have to go from this uncontrolled to controlled dumping to engineered landfilling to incineration of waste to greater recycling to the circular economy? Or can we leapfrog? Can we leapfrog from uncontrolled and controlled dumping to a circular economy? And there are many who say the jump is just too big. We can't do it. You've got to follow the stepwise approach. And we're saying, well, why? You know, we were able to leapfrog in terms of telecommunications from none. We were able to leapfrog landline telecommunication right into cellular telecommunication. So why can't we leapfrog the same from dumping to a circular economy? So I think the argument at the moment is to say, how do we drive a greater circular economy agenda and unlock this resource value in our waste, which, as I've shown, comes with this economic and social value, as opposed to simply burning our waste, because we don't have the same, for example, demand as we see in Norway, where that heat then goes into district heating, etc. And the heat that comes out of the burning of waste kind of plays an important part in the system. So again, I could have a whole day just discussing that one. But I think what we're saying is, rather, let's drive a greater circular economy agenda with that waste to energy perhaps as a last resort for maybe that final 5 to 10%, which cannot be recycled, while we address that last 5 to 10%, because it's actually the symptom of poor design, and we need to actually change those products to be more circular. Thanks, Carl.
Thank you, Linda. There's a question from Nicole that says, oh, sorry, it jumped. To increase the cost to send waste to landfill, that would mean better enforcement of illegal dumping. Has this proved successful in a developing world context?
So absolutely, these have to be done hand in hand. You know, speaking to many municipalities say, well, we don't want to increase the tipping fees because it leads to illegal dumping, and we know that that's already a major issue in Africa. I mean, we just see it. So it has to be done hand in hand with education, with awareness around, you know, why it's so important to deal with these issues responsibly. It has to be done of putting resources in place in terms of greater enforcement. So we need enforcement officials to be in place to deal with these issues. So it's, again, it's kind of a systems response. But I think, you know, we can no longer say, well, we can't we can't put responsible landfilling of waste in place, and hence together with it comes increased costs, because we're scared of illegal dumping. You know, other countries, developed countries, have been able to do it, and so we have to put the systems in place, because we cannot continue with the uncontrolled dump sites that we currently see in Africa. Thanks.
Thank you, Linda. There's another question that says, how do you engage industry without intimidating them into thinking their internal processes are being questioned or attacked?
A really great question. You know, for me, it's around public-private partnerships, and not necessarily through the traditional kind of formal PPPs, but it requires, there's almost a new form of governance that is required, is that we need to be having healthier debates between the public and private sector, and we all need to be pulling in the same direction to solve these challenges. And I think, you know, government on its own does not have the resources to deal with these issues, whether it be the financial resources, whether it be, you know, people in the offices or on the ground. Government in developing countries does not have the resources to deal with these problems. And so we need government to be working together with the private sector, with the brand owners, with the retailers, with the waste generators, to say, how do we collectively deal with this issue in terms of safely and responsibly managing waste, that bringing waste under control, while at the same time unlocking these socio-economic opportunities around waste as resource. Unfortunately, you know, what we're seeing in many developing countries is it's still very much this top-down command and control regulation, where, you know, we kind of enforce or we impose the regulations onto the private sector. And I think we do need to move beyond that if we are truly going to unlock the value in waste, and then obviously also the whole upstream issue around design. Thank you.
Then there's another comment that says, Dear Linda, great presentation. Thank you. I completely agree we need to tackle plastic waste. However, are there other waste categories such as building rubble which don't get as much attention? And what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. A great question as well. You know, in developing countries, so much of the focus at the moment is around the paper and packaging waste. Because it's easily recyclable, because there's already some activity happening there. There's some value that has been created. The informal sector has moved into that space, but it's a fairly small component of the municipal waste stream. You know, maybe it's somewhere between 10 and 20% of a municipal solid waste stream. The two biggest components of municipal solid waste are your construction and demolition waste, or your building rubble, and it's your organic waste. And those are also two waste streams that you can't implement policy instruments like extended producer responsibility. So it means that your municipalities do need to take action against those two waste streams, but again, in partnership with the private sector, because they are two waste streams that, again, do contain value. So how do we, for example, in municipalities look at separation at source for organic waste? And again, there's a whole presentation which I do just around that one, around collection systems for organic waste and beneficiation, and also bringing the informal sector into the organic waste space. So it's around creating demand for this waste stream. And where you create demand for a waste stream, trust me, the informal sector will move into that space. And we see this in some cities in India, again, for example, where the municipality has put infrastructure in place where the informal sector collects organic waste. They then take it to these centralized bins and they drop it off, and they're compensated for the collection of organic waste. And now you have economies of scale to then feed that organic waste, whether it be into composting, whether it be into biogas, whether it be into more advanced biorefinery, Again, it's around creating the value, it's around this economics, and the material will flow into that value chain. For building rubble, absolutely. I know Green Cape in Cape Town, South Africa, has done a lot of work around building waste, for example, and how do we utilize that? How do we utilize it back into alternative building material? How do we utilize it in terms of aggregate? And again, it's speaking to these policy issues is to say, well, if we find, for example, that the price of virgin aggregate is so cheap, how do we compensate for that by making secondary aggregate from construction and demolition waste attractive? So do you tax, for example, virgin aggregate to create a market for building rubble and aggregate? But it's really around, the strategy needs to be for each waste stream is to essentially look at how do we create value and how do we create demand for that waste stream. And then through this joint kind of public-private sector engagement of saying, what policy do we need to put in place that essentially helps us all, that helps government, that helps the private sector achieve these objectives? Thank you.
Thanks, Linda. There's another comment that says, great presentation, but they noticed you didn't mention a lot about education and awareness of consumers. If action needs to be taken now, both upstream and downstream, is there a roadmap that takes all of this into consideration? This would also mean appropriate policy instruments must happen now and leave little time for deliberation.
Oh, yes. I mean, great question. That one came from Salim. Thanks, Salim. Again, I could spend a whole day talking about this issue around education and awareness of consumers. Absolutely. If we're wanting to speak about, for example, alternative delivery methods of getting products to consumers in a less resource intensive way, in a way that doesn't, for example, include single-use packaging, we need to be educating consumers that, that they accept these changes. A lot of technologies fail because, not because they're not a great technology, it's just because we don't have this uptake and the acceptance by the consumer. So absolutely, we need to be educating our consumers all the way across in terms of, responsible consumption, responsible product management, responsible management of product at end of life, why it's so important not to illegally dump, why it's so important not to litter, the fact that waste does have value, for example. And I think, again, I think this is one of the big differences that we see between developed and developing countries, is we have a much more environmentally conscious and aware society typically in our developed countries that understand why these issues are so important. Some of the photos that I showed, for example, around the diapers, just lying in the field, my first thought is, why do these communities think that this is okay? Why do they accept that this is the norm, to live in a space surrounded by waste diapers, which in many other countries would not be accepted at all? So, absolutely, we need to do more. I don't think, and I speak under correction, and I probably need to follow up with Pew and systemic, in that the question now becomes, now that we have, for example, the Breaking the Plastic Wave study, what education and awareness do we need to put in place specifically that speaks to that report? Maybe that's a gap. And then secondly, what policy do we need to put in place that speaks to that report, given the fact that we saw the existing policy only has about a 7% impact on reducing leakage, certainly of plastic. So yeah, really, really great question. And these things do absolutely need attention, because these all go hand in hand. Technology has to go hand in hand together with education, and it has to go hand in hand with policy. And very importantly, policy enforcement, which again is a weak point in many developing countries. Sometimes we have great legislation and regulation, but we don't have great enforcement of that regulation. Thanks, Salim.
Thanks, Linda. There are a few more questions in the Q&A section that said, you mentioned that 70 to 80% of African litter can be recycled. Does this include litter that is dirty and considered unrecyclable, or does this percentage take that into account?
Yeah, so I think I must check the wording I used, but I think it was 70 to 80% of waste generated in Africa is potentially recyclable. So that would be if you take your organic waste, which in some countries in Africa can be as high as 50, 60, 70% of your municipal waste stream is simply wet organic waste. In your more middle income countries, it probably drops down to about 30%, 40% is organic waste. Then if you take on top of that your building rubble, your construction and demolition waste, again, that could be anywhere kind of between 20 to 40% of your waste stream. Your paper and packaging is probably another 10 to 20%. So if you add just those three waste streams, organic waste, building rubble, and paper and packaging, that brings you up to around about your 70 to 80% figure, which leaves you with this last sort of 20% of residual waste. And so the strategy that we've kind of been promoting is to say, if we could just deal with those three waste streams and take them out early in the system. So put in a separate, let's say, even if it's just wet dry, take out your organic waste at source, take out your mixed recyclables at source. Your building rubble tends to kind of follow a different route because it's where people are building, for example. Put in technologies and solutions for just those three waste streams. If you were a municipality, could you imagine if suddenly you were faced with 70 to 80% less waste that you were dealing with? It meant that you could then finance probably proper engineered landfill sites, sanitary engineered landfill sites for that last 20 to 30% of the waste. The organic waste was going into composting or biogas. The C&D waste was going into something. Paper and packaging was going back into mechanical recycling. It speaks back to Carl's question of saying, well, maybe we then don't need really expensive thermal treatment processes like incineration, pyrolysis, because as a continent, we have space. Incineration was largely driven in Europe because of lack of space for disposal sites. So it was around putting alternative waste technologies in place. But we have space in Africa for proper sanitary engineered landfills for that last 20 to 30% of our residual waste. So absolutely, I do think that we could quite easily put a strategy in place to deal with 70 to 80% of the waste being generated in Africa, which would allow us to bring waste under control while at the same time harnessing that opportunity of waste as resource. Thanks.
Thanks, Linda. There's another comment that says, thank you for the great presentation. What's your opinion about the possibility to implement and scale up chemical recycling techniques, both plastic to fuel and plastic to plastic, for treating plastic waste that cannot be treated through mechanical recycling?
Great. So again, this was a big debate question in the Breaking the Plastic Wave study was, could we solve this problem just through chemical recycling of essentially, polymer back to polymer and, kind of a completely circular plastics economy. I think one of the things that was found is that chemical recycling tends to have a much bigger carbon footprint. So in terms of also, energy intensity, greenhouse gas emissions, chemical recycling is still a less preferred technology option to mechanical recycling. But I think there is acknowledgement now that it is part of the basket of technologies that are required to deal with products. So, there may be certain products that cannot be redesigned because the functionality of that product in terms of whether it be longevity of food or protecting food or whatever it might be, it cannot be redesigned to something else. And so it does require finding a solution for something that is currently not mechanically recycling. And their chemical recycling does play a part in that solution. But again, recognizing the kind of the potential environmental impacts that come with chemical recycling, and also really importantly at this stage at least recognizing the much higher costs that come with chemical recycling. But I would say that it is part of the basket of technology solutions we need to be looking at. Thank you.
Thanks, Linda. There's a last question here, and then there were some that were sent ahead of time. From Liam, there's a comment that says, hi, Dr. Godfrey, very insightful presentation. Thank you. In light of the recent global attention and sensationalism surrounding the runaway climate change deadline and expanding understanding of environmental economics, is there greater pressure on governments and private sector to enact radical change or policies?
Thanks so much, Liam, for that question, and for bringing these two issues together around waste and climate change. I've been working in the waste sector now for more than 20 years, and when I started, waste was very much one of those issues. Well, you generate it in your own country, and frankly, we kind of really don't sort of care about how you manage it. It was very much kind of a country-specific issue, and it was very much an isolated issue. Unlike water, for example, which is transboundary, and what happens in one country impacts another country. But certainly over the last few years, we've been seeing this issue around this link between waste and climate change, whether it be at the upstream stage in terms of the climate impacts of production of products which have very short lifespan. So the whole single use production and the environmental impacts and the resource intensity that goes with that, or whether it be the downstream in terms of kind of this wasteful consumerism and the disposal of waste to land, which does have climate impacts. Certainly the biggest climate impacts with waste very often, typically tend to come from organic waste and the biodegradation, whether it be anaerobic or aerobic, of organic waste. So more and more we're seeing this link between waste and climate change. And it was the reason why, in fact, in South Africa, our Department of Science and Innovation established a research chair in waste and climate change, is to better understand this and to be able to decouple this issue of consumption and disposal from climate impacts. I don't think, certainly in developing countries, I don't think that we're yet seeing the policy response in terms of that potential link. But what we're doing now is to try and feed the evidence in to the discussion that is happening nationally and regionally. And hopefully what we'll see together with that is then appropriate policies being put in place. Because I think, if I remember correctly, from South Africa, at least from our last greenhouse gas inventory, the waste sector was the second largest contributor in terms of methane contribution to our greenhouse gas inventory. So the waste sector does have a sizable contribution, obviously not anywhere near in magnitude in terms of energy and mobility, but I absolutely think that there needs to be more emphasis on this link between waste and climate impacts. But great question. Thanks, Liam.
Thanks, Linda. There were a few questions sent ahead of time, some of which you did cover in your talk, such as the innovative solutions for waste, which you mentioned in your last few slides. I just want to bring up two of them that says, what are some of the new environmental services that companies should be aware of?
I suppose it depends on what you mean by environmental services, but I think probably the most disruptive that we are seeing enter into the space at the moment now is this issue of the sharing economy. And in fact, I attended a really great webinar yesterday given by GGKP, the Green Growth Knowledge Platform, around material efficiency and mobility in buildings. And inherent in this discussion was this issue of access to shared space and to shared transportation. And so I think this issue of the sharing economy is probably going to be one of the biggest disruptors to business that we've probably seen in the last century. I'm going to put my head on the block with that one. Because of the business opportunities, because of the opportunity for much greater resource efficiency and resource use, it's going to be. I'm just really excited to see the business response to the sharing economy, and particularly from a developing country context, because a lot of what we're seeing in terms of shared mobility, for example, in the EU, sharing of electric powered vehicles, for example, the question is, can one drop those kinds of sharing economy solutions into a developing country context, given issues around crime, given issues around poverty, for example, given issues around culture and acceptance of certain solutions? It's going to be a really, really interesting space to see. Thanks.
Thanks, Linda. And then there's another one that says, can you speak more about the landfill ban and its effect and what this means for companies and waste management companies and services and the services they provide going forward, both from financial and business model perspectives?
Oh, okay. I mean, that's a deep question. Again, landfill bans are one of those policy responses to kind of correcting the economics around waste and around forcing waste streams. Well, I mean, part of it. The other part is the fact that, certainly for certain hazardous waste streams, we don't want to be putting them into land because of the long-term environmental and human health impact. So, but again, it is one of those policy responses to try and force waste streams. So, the bans on organic waste, the Western Cape province, for example, in South Africa, has put also strict requirements in place of kind of zero organic waste in the medium to long term to land, again, to essentially incentivize and also to send a very clear signal to the private sector to say, you guys can actually invest in technologies around organic waste because there's reduced risk and there's some kind of surety that you'll be able to access this feedstock. So I think absolutely it makes sense to put bans in place. But again, it has to be done in consultation with the private sector. So, you can't put a ban in place today and expect that the private sector will have responded. So there needs to be sufficient lead time so that business can respond of putting the appropriate technologies in place. And again, given the quite strict regulation that we see in some countries, you need quite some lead time. Especially if you've got to go through licensing, if you've got to go through environmental impact assessments, for example. But I think it does send a great signal to the private sector in terms of unlocking opportunities. I don't know I think there was a lot more to that question, but I can't recall the second half of it.
I think the second half was talking about how it would affect the business model perspectives. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Well, it depends on who the business is. If we're talking about the business model being the generator of the waste, I mean, obviously that has significant financial implications for the business because now they have to find alternative solutions, and those alternative solutions usually come at a cost. That's not to say that is necessarily a negative thing, because I think, that increase in cost needs to then come with that business looking for alternative solutions of saying, well, waste is typically the result of inefficient processes. So can they then look at cleaner production initiatives? Can they look at industrial symbiosis opportunities of reducing the amount of waste that they generate in the first place, and certainly reducing the toxicity of the waste that they generate in the first place? So that increase in cost then incentivizes the business to look at their own internal solutions to what needs to be done. Whether it be the business in terms of that is investing in the new solution, I mean, I think that is a positive, is that we do have the potential now to create all new kinds of businesses. In Africa, we don't have anywhere near the potential in terms of things like, businesses operating in biogas or in anaerobic digestion. We don't have a lot of composting happening on the continent. We have this whole, in terms of industrial biomass from agriculture, food processing, the opportunities that sit in biorefinery, for example. I mean, we haven't even tapped into those opportunities as a continent. So there will be winners and losers in terms of landfill bans. But again, I believe it's the potential to kickstart and incentivize alternative action and alternative behavior inside businesses and unlocking new businesses. Thanks.
Thanks, Linda. There's a comment in the Q&A section from Salim that says, the savings emphasized in the presentation can well be used in ensuring skills upliftments within the waste sector, and this can be used across the board. Exciting times, and he agrees with the better landfill management as well. Chemical recycling fits in well with the innovation leg, and hence this can be run in parallel with mechanical recycling. And so glad you did not condone illegal dumping in the face of increased landfill costs. It should never be an excuse. Thanks for that, Salim. I don't see any other questions in the chat or in the Q&A section. But if anyone does have any at a later stage, you're welcome to email us webinars@sstafrica.org.za, and we can pass those along to Linda. I don't see any other questions at this time. So I just want to say thank you so much, Linda, for your time and for your presentation today. I think it was incredibly informative. So thank you so much for that.
You're absolutely welcome, and thanks for the really brilliant questions. It almost sounded like we needed to have a whole day on this topic.
I think we quite easily could. so many questions I think would still pop up then. I just want to draw everyone's attention while you're here that this webinar series will be happening each week and with different presenters, but at the same time, which will be 11:15 in South Africa and 10:15 in Norway. But yes, thank you so much, Linda. And everyone else, you can find information about our upcoming webinars either on our events page or through following our social media pages. This session was recorded and we will be uploading it along with the slides to our webpage at a later time. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Tara.